In our last episode, the boy Sultan Abdulmajid inherited a throne weighed down with defeat. His father Mahmud II had died as Ottoman armies crumbled at Nizip, routed once again by the brilliant Ibrahim Pasha of Egypt. At 16, Abdulmajid found himself not the master of an empire, but the symbol of one already unraveling. But worse was yet to come. The empire's shame would not be confined to battlefields. It would drift into Alexandria under Ottoman flags and never return. This is Road to Destruction, the World Wars. By the time news of Nizip reached Istanbul, Mahmud II had already breathed his last. The city mourned its Iron Sultan, whose reforms had promised strength but delivered fragility in their unfinished state. As Abdulmajid ascended the throne, some whispered that the writing was already on the wall for the war, and for the Ottoman Empire itself. Those whispers were loudest in the navy, where officers and sailors debated loyalties, measured opportunities, and quietly questioned whether their allegiance lay with the Sultan or with survival. The news spread like wildfire. The Ottoman fleet, the very pride of Mahmud's late reforms, had defected. Entire squadrons of ships, under the command of Kapudan Pasha, the Grand Admiral, sailed south and delivered themselves into the hands of Muhammad Ali. The Sultan's warships, trained, armed, and paid for at crushing expense, now anchored under Egyptian colors. The motives of the Grand Admiral remain debated. Some say bribery, others disillusionment, still others an opportunistic gamble. But the meaning was plain. Loyalty inside the empire was fragile, even for sale. For a boy, Sultan scarcely weeks into his reign, it was his first true lesson in the politics of survival. The humiliation was almost unbearable. His father, Mahmud, had rebuilt this navy as a symbol of revival, a monument to his campaign of reform. Now, in Abdulmajid's first months, it was gone, not lost in battle, but surrendered by treachery. The capital erupted in panic. Istanbul was a city of the sea, perched between the Bosphorus and the Golden Horn. Lifelines carried not just grain and goods, but the very sense that the empire was still connected, still relevant. Without a fleet, the Ottomans were exposed, their coasts undefended, their trade at the mercy of others, their prestige in ruins. In mosques, sermons thundered against treachery. On the streets, people muttered that the empire was cursed for abandoning the old ways. Had God finally abandoned the Ottomans? Clerics warned that reforms had brought only humiliation. Reformers countered that the empire had not reformed enough. In the palace, silence reigned. The boy Sultan could offer words but no solutions. Ministers in the palace stared at one another with silence that bordered on despair. The boy Sultan could do nothing but watch. It was his first lesson in rule. Loyalty was fragile, even at the highest ranks. The authority that a sultan once carried had eroded perhaps beyond repair, and already Europe was circling the wreck. The crisis pulled Europe into motion. France, already entangled with Muhammad Ali, Paris saw in him not only a modernizing strongman, but a client to shape the Eastern Mediterranean in France's image. French officers had drilled his army, advised his administration, and even helped model his fleet. To Paris, Egypt offered a vision of the East remade in France's image. Britain and Austria moved to block this, not out of love for the Ottomans, but to deny French power over the trade routes of the Levant. Metternich in Vienna schemed to keep the Eastern question contained, while Palmerston in London feared for the safety of the Mediterranean lifeline, a lifeline that would one day flow through a canal at Suez. The Eastern question sharpened to a naval question. Who would dominate the seas that bound Europe, Asia, and Africa together? Russia, too, offered help to its new friend, keen to extend its own shadow across the Black Sea and into the Straits. The Ottoman Sultan, barely a teenager, was little more than the object of negotiation between leaders and men far his senior in European-style diplomacy and warfare. His empire had become the battlefield of a proxy war, its fate decided in the drawing rooms of London, Paris, Vienna, and St. Petersburg. By 1840, the great powers decided. The Treaty of London stripped Muhammad Ali of Syria and confined him to hereditary rule in Egypt. When he resisted, it was not Ottoman guns that broke his grip, but European ones. British and Austrian fleets sailed the Levant. They bombarded Beirut. They reduced Acre, a fortress that had resisted Napoleon himself with devastating modern firepower. In weeks, Muhammad Ali's expansion crumbled, not before Ottoman might, but before European naval supremacy. The Ottomans celebrated victory, but in truth it was no victory of their own. The fleet that had betrayed them was never truly recovered. The empire had been saved, but only because Europe knew what they could gain. Dependency. The symbolism was impossible to miss. At sea, the Ottomans no longer commanded their own fate. Their ships were gone. Their ports lay under the shadow of foreign squadrons. Their survival depended on Europe's willingness to keep them afloat. Britain emerged as the master of the Mediterranean, protector, enforcer, and quiet jailer. For London especially, the Ottoman crisis had been more than a war. It was routine, a tried and tested way of how British sea power could dictate terms, a classic portrayal of protecting their trade routes and utilizing crisis to extend influence. As the defection of the fleet and losses on land would sink the Ottoman Empire into even more financial strain, which perhaps could help France and England control the Ottomans even more than the military and naval dependencies. For Abdul-Majid, this was his first real test. He had done nothing to lose the fleet and nothing to win it back. His empire had endured, but only because Europe deemed it useful. Each victory now came with shackles. Alliances that dictated terms, rescues that felt like occupations. In London, statesmen spoke of preserving the balance of power. In Istanbul, it felt like submission dressed up as salvation. The boy sultan absorbed the lesson. The empire could no longer survive on its own. Sovereignty was no longer a shield. It was a performance, tolerated only so long as it suited the great powers. In our next episode, Mustafa Reshid Pasha steps forward. The Edict of Gulhane proclaims a new order, rights, laws and reforms designed not just to heal the empire, but to impress its European patrons. This is Road to Destruction, the World Wars.